Hello, good listeners, and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives, where we bring you stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Today we conclude our two-part series on Mennonite adventurer Jacob Hoemsen. In part 1, we learned about Jacob's challenging childhood and his experiences as a medic in war times. Today we'll look at his involvement with the Mennonite Self Defence Unit, or Selbstschutz, his final years in the Soviet Union, and his life in Canada. Let's set the scene. Overlapping World War I was the Ukrainian War of Independence that lasted from March 1917 to November 1921. The battles involved a bewildering array of 7 warring groups, and Jacob's home in Halberstadt was near the center of it all. When Jacob returned home from the front lines in the spring of 1918, German forces occupied Halberstadt. In need of a job and being fluent in German and Russian, Jacob became an interpreter for the occupying German army. His diary describes daily tasks of resolving domestic disturbances and setting prices for food items to prevent profiteering. Jacob was invited to go to Germany with the retreating forces at the end of World War I, but he declined. He wrote, "They invited me to accompany them, but I could see no future in a defeated Germany, so I stayed behind." Seeking a safe haven after the German troops left, Jacob moved to Waldheim to work at a local store. He wrote about interpreters being punished for their work with the Germans, and worried he too would become a target. His fears were well-founded. Jacob was called in for questioning before the chairman of the local Soviet, but was released, and nothing more came of his past. Meanwhile, numerous Mennonite communities were caught up in the widespread strife of the times. Roving battalions led by the anarchist Nestor Makhno were murdering Mennonites and pillaging their farms. The violence in post-war Ukraine challenged Jacob's pacifist upbringing. In response to the death and destruction in his area, Jacob joined the Gnadenfeld Mennonite Selbstschutz, or Self-Defense Force, sometime in late 1918. The self-defense forces were controversial in Mennonite communities. The men joining these German-trained and armed units were viewed as betraying the pacifist convictions of their faith. Jacob felt that the self-defense units performed an essential purpose and were justified. He wrote, "When I returned home from the war and learned about the terror of Makhno, I left the non-resistance stance behind and took up arms, not in the White Army units, but with the self-defense." Jacob remained a member of the self-defense forces until early 1919, saying he was too old to continue. But he was proud of his contribution and felt that the suffering of the Mennonites would have been far greater if not for the self-defense leagues. He later reflected that they deserved appreciation for their heroism, not the condemnation they now receive. As the multi-layered conflict dragged on, Jacob tried to build a stable life. In 1919, he became an assistant to Dr. Frank Dick at a private hospital in Waldheim. Here, he met his future wife Maria Heidebrecht, a nurse. The hospital was closed due to fighting in the summer of 1919, throwing Jacob out of work and forcing Maria to leave. Despite their brief relationship, Jacob proposed to her before returning to her family in Gnadenthal. She said yes, and on September 15th, Maria and Jacob were married at her parents' home. Jacob wrote, "We had an old-fashioned wedding with a very large gathering. The next day we drove to Halberstadt, where I had rented rooms in a house belonging to J. Harder, and for a while we lived together with them until our house was available." Prior to the war, Jacob had worked for the agricultural equipment manufacturer Franz and Schrader. He found work in their reopened office, and the couple started life together with a home and enough income to survive. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had secured power over most of Ukraine, ending the Civil War. The new government began experimenting with different systems of state-run enterprise, while crushed and dispirited citizens tried to recover from years of war trauma. The result was a confusing mix of policies where common people like Jacob and his family paid the price. The new regime requisitioned crops, so even with good harvests, there was little food. Jacob's employer, Franz Schrader, was first nationalized and then closed in 1923. Without raw materials for production and no customers to buy products, work dried up. Then came a time of great loss in Jacob's family life. First, their 2-year-old daughter Maria developed a fever and died on January 6, 1922. Just over a month later, Jacob and Maria welcomed a little boy named Rudy. He died just 2 months later after a minor surgery. Jacob writes that we could hardly bear our pain. Amidst their grief, they welcomed a baby girl they named Margarita in June 1923. Despite the family's sorrow and political uncertainty, Jacob describes a sense of normality in the early years of his marriage. Weekly rituals included church on Sundays, followed by the traditional light faspa meal with family and friends. The closure of Franz and Schrader and no means to support his young family left Jacob hopeless. Then, in early 1924, he was asked to join the government of a new district made by amalgamating Gnadenfeld and Halbstadt. Jacob cautiously accepted a role in finance. There was little training provided, and under the authoritarian Soviet system, a mistake could be viewed as sabotage, resulting in arrest or death. Despite the risks, Jacob had little choice but to accept the position. With a steady income, Jacob and Maria's lives stabilized. Still, they yearned for freedom. Jacob wrote, "Although in 1924 we could make a good living, we were longing for personal and political freedom. The little freedom we now enjoyed in the economic sphere could be so easily taken away from us." Jacob did not trust that things would improve. He was aware that some Mennonites had left Germany in 1923 in advance of eventual settlement in Canada. Jacob and Maria decided to leave too, with the goal of departing in the fall of 1924. Passports were prepaid, possessions sold, and Jacob found a replacement for his government job, a condition of his departure. But things did not go according to plan. The expected passports did not arrive, and his work replacement proved inadequate. By December, still waiting for passports and living with his in-laws in Gradenthal, Jacob returned to his old job. His final months working for the local government were tense. When local officials requested a financial report, they found that the district budget Jacob had created left them unable to cover wages at the end of the year. Jacob feared his mistake would be interpreted as treason, punishable by imprisonment, or worse. With some creative accounting, he adjusted the budget so that workers got paid and the accounts were balanced, and no one was the wiser. Jacob breathed a sigh of relief. Later, he learned that his successor had been arrested, a fate he was sure would have been his. In early May of 1925, over 6 months later than planned, the long-awaited passports finally arrived. Jacob and Maria moved quickly. On May 25th, the couple and their young family, now consisting of daughter Margarita and newborn Katerina, started their journey. A train took them to Moscow, then across northern Europe, and finally to Liverpool, England. The last leg of their journey would be an Atlantic voyage to Quebec City, Canada. However, they were forced to pause their journey in Liverpool when their daughters failed the health exam needed to enter Canada. First diagnosed with an eye infection and then measles, Margarita was forced to quarantine for 6 weeks while the rest of the family waited in a large refugee camp called Atlantic Park at Southampton. Little Marg, as Jacob called her, was quarantined and treated. Maria and baby Katerina were then also placed in a 2-week quarantine. All Jacob could do was wait anxiously. Finally, little Margarita's treatment concluded, and she was cleared. But her time away from Jacob and Maria had been harrowing. Jacob wrote that she had nearly forgotten how to speak and looked as if she had been starved. But they finally had permission to depart for Canada. The Hoemsen family boarded the SS Melita on July 29, 1925. Crossing the rough seas of the North Atlantic made Jacob and Maria seasick. But, with his characteristic humor, Jacob described their sick time as a heavy tribute to the Sea Lord Neptune. Fortunately, the children were unaffected. The family landed at Quebec City on the 7th of August, 1925. Their journey had taken 4 months, but they were finally in Canada. They traveled by rail to Rosthern, Saskatchewan, arriving on August 11th. Jacob and Maria confronted many challenges in their new life. The food disagreed with Jacob's stomach, and the language and culture presented barriers. Moreover, at 46 years old, Jacob struggled with the manual labor expected of new migrants. But he persevered and even became invigorated when he thought about his new life in Canada. He wrote, "Here we could live free from personal fear, anarchy, and government control. Then I would feel more hopeful, and my energy would come back, so that it was possible to proceed with the work." The family found life in Saskatchewan hard, so in 1928 they moved to Kingsville, Ontario, to be closer to Maria's sister. Just 2 years later they moved again, this time to Griswold, Manitoba, for a work opportunity. Jacob continued to work labor jobs while Maria found housekeeping work. They raised 4 more children. Other than a brief period in Ontario in their later years, Jacob and Maria raised their family and spent their golden years in the Griswold area. Jacob continued to keenly observe current events and people. He engaged with the wider world through letters to the editor in the Mennonite German-language newspaper Der Bote. Through the paper, he cultivated a wide circle of correspondence in Canada, the United States, and Germany, which gave him a great sense of value and allowed him to share his experiences in World War I and the early Soviet Union. Despite the challenges of resettling in Canada, Jacob was often thankful. The last entry in his diary reads, "The feeling of gratitude for being among the lucky ones, to have escaped the Red Terror, and appreciation for the life and freedoms we have here in Canada has never left me." Jacob Hoemsen died on October 1st, 1969. He was 90 years old. That concludes our 2-part series on the life of Mennonite adventurer Jacob Hoemsen. The primary source for this story came from the Jacob Hoemsen collection housed at the Mennonite Heritage Archives in Winnipeg. To listen to part 1 of Jacob's story, learn more about him, and see some related photos, visit mharchives.ca. We'd love to know what you're taking away from the stories we share. Send us a comment via email to info@mharchives.ca.
Hello, I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. The Mennonite Heritage Archives is a community-supported memory center that relies on donations from community members like you. To support this program and the preservation of Mennonite history, visit mharchives.ca and click on Support, or give us a call at 204-560-1998. Thanks also to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, the Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, Mennonite Church Canada, and Golden West Radio.
In an upcoming episode, we'll bring you the story of how a group of migrant Mennonites became stranded aboard a ship in the icy waters of Lake Superior. Sitting in for me on that episode will be guest host Sarah Dick. Today's story about Jacob Hoemsen was researched and written by Graham Unruh. Margarita Silver translated the Hoemsen diaries from German to English. Thanks to the Tales team of Conrad Stace and David Klippenstein for their help with the show. I'm your host, Dan Dick. We'll be back next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.